Hey, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to the channel and to a brand new video. In this week's video, you'll see me make this mid-century inspired modern version of a pedestal table. This is made from rough sawn red oak. I got to try a lot of different things that I've never done before. Some worked really well. I might do some things a little different next time, but anyway, in this video, I'll show you every step of how I made this table, and let's go ahead and get started. So this table, or at least the base of this table, will be completely dependent upon having a template to cut everything out with using a flush cut trim bit on my router. A lot of templates that make up this style of table will either be cut on a CNC, or if you don't have a CNC, you can often find these templates either on Etsy or just online somewhere. Now, I don't have a CNC and rather pay probably the 20 bucks that a template costs. I decided to spend a whole lot more time and make this way more complicated than it needed to be, and by that I mean I made my own template. And to make my own template, as I mentioned, I'm just using some 3/4 inch composite board. This is a junk piece of board I've been needing to get rid of for a while. But anyway, I drew a rough outline of where I wanted the template lines to be, and then I cut these lines out using a spiral upcut bit in my compact router. You might notice in this shot that the circle I cut out on the top portion isn't exactly lined up on that line, and that's perfectly okay. This doesn't have to fit the template exactly that I drew with the marker, it just needs to be close. The important part that does matter is that there's a smooth transition from the straight line to that circle. That way when I actually cut this template piece out, I can use the flush cut trim bit to cut it all the way through, and there will be a smooth transition in those corners. So on the straight edges on the outside of this template, I used the table saw with the crosscut sled and the track saw to cut those straight angles out. I could cut all the way through on those, but on these inside curves, I needed to first cut that out with the jigsaw, then move to the flush cut trim bit, which has a bearing on the top part of the bit, which will ride right up against that smooth groove I cut with the router and trim the rest of the excess out to match that perfectly flush. Because the table base will be a reflection of the other side, I only need to cut one piece of this template out. Then I can flip it over and use that as a mirror image of the other side. So once I had everything roughly laid out, all I'm doing here is measuring the distance that the stretchers will need to be, as well as the length that the legs will need to be to make this piece up. For some reason on the leg pieces, I thought that I would need to cut the angle at this point in time, which turned out not to be true at all. So just ignore the fact that the leg pieces are already cut at an angle. I did that by mistake. And speaking of mistakes, I also cut twice the amount of top and bottom stretchers that I needed. I didn't realize that at this point in the glue up, but we all make mistakes and it was no big deal just to have a couple extra pieces in case anything went wrong. And speaking of the glue up, what I'm doing here is laminating multiple pieces together to make them thicker. So all of the pieces in the bottom of the base of this table are about 1 3/4 inches thick. The only stock that I had available was about 1 inch thick, so it would have been easier to use 8/4 lumber, but I didn't have any of that available. So I made my own by gluing multiple pieces together. While all of those base pieces were drying in that glue up, I went ahead and got started on the tabletop. The tabletop will also be made from rough sawn red oak. So first we need to go through the basic milling process to get everything nice and square so that it's easy to glue up and lines up nicely. We do that milling process by first starting on the joiner, joining one face, then joining one edge. Next we go over to the planer and plane the opposite face from that first joint face, and then we'll go over to the table saw and rip everything to the appropriate width we need for the glue up. A lot of times you'll hear that the orientation of the growth rings on the boards need to be flipped in opposing directions to offset any wood movement. While I'm sure there is some truth to that, I like to just set the boards up by whatever looks the best and wherever I have the best joints that'll allow for the best glue ups on the sides. I trimmed the edges off a couple of the end boards that wouldn't be within the diameter of the circle that I'm going to cut this out, which would just make it a bit easier to put some clamps on the ends of those. Because this round table will obviously be way too wide to fit through my planer and I don't have a giant drum sander, I used dominoes to make sure everything would be aligned at the joints. If you don't have a domino, you can do the exact same thing with a biscuit joiner or just using dowels, both of which I've used in the past and do work very well. I just happen to be a decent bit faster using the dominoes, so that's what I opted to use. The diameter of this table ended up being 47.5 inches. However, before I have the circle cut out, these boards are about 50 inches across, which of course is just outside the range of my 48-inch bar clamps, so I use some pipe clamps instead to clamp this thing together. And later on, after that glue was dry, it was then time to turn this thing into a circle. So I first need to find the exact center of these boards, drill a small hole not all the way through, maybe a quarter of the way through or so, and then just using a circle jig that I made myself, I could cut this circle right out using a router and a spiral upcut bit. It took me a grand total of maybe 10 seconds or so before I realized that trying to cut this circle out on this tabletop, while it balanced on some flimsy sawhorses, probably was not the best idea. So I moved it over to my workbench where it was much more stable, and the risk of this thing falling down with a router bit spinning at probably 20,000 RPMs would be a whole lot less than it was on those sawhorses. Just like we did with the template in the first part of the video, we will cut a smooth groove with the router and the jig first, then grab the jigsaw to cut the shape out itself, leaving a little bit of a rough edge before going back and trimming that up with the flush cut trim bit on the router. After what seemed like an eternity of sanding, that tabletop was finally finished, and we could go back to these blocks that we glued up for the leg bases finally. If you ever want a reason where you purposely have to throw something down, all you really have to do is accidentally get a little bit of glue in between the seams you weren't supposed to, and the only way to get that apart is by slamming it down on your workbench. So take my advice here and don't be afraid to get a little wild on that glue up, which presents you with the opportunity to throw some stuff around and you finally don't have to feel bad about it. So each of those pieces we glued together get milled up again just because there was glue all over everything, and then after they're milled on each side, we'll finally take them over to the template and cross-cut and get them to the proper lengths that they need to be to where we can put them together and make the base for the bottom of this. So you might be wondering what angle these legs are at in case you want to make this for yourself, and honestly I have absolutely no idea what the angle is, and it doesn't matter what the angle is because all we have to do are lay the pieces out and then trace where it overlaps. Now I definitely should have had the orientation of these backwards where the stretchers were down on the table and the legs were over top, so it would have been much easier to trace and I wouldn't have had to look super awkward leaning upside down like that. But anyway, all you do is overlap the pieces to where you can mark the overlap of that angle, and then you can cut that out and everything should match up in place. To assemble these pieces together, I'll be using dominoes. So each piece will first need to be lined up where everything goes together. Then you can just mark a line using a square or some type of straight edge that'll line those pieces up for where you can cut that tenon out with the domino. Speaking of the domino, if you are interested in checking out the domino or any of the other tools in this video, you can check out the description where I have a link to each tool that I used. So the matching tenons to the mortises we cut with a domino will be used to hold everything into place. And then clamping this up can be a little tricky. So if you just throw a clamp on the edges of this where the angle is cut, that clamp will slide right off. So one thing you can do is to take the scrap cutoff pieces that we used earlier and put them in place on the end of the clamps. And after these frames were glued together, of course we had a problem, which was that my template didn't match up with the frame piece that I made. So I had to get a little clever here and use the template sort of like I did on that router template in the very beginning to offset it until it finally matched up on all of the curves. And just like we did once again with that router template in the beginning, we'll draw a line, cut out everything with a jigsaw very close to that line but not going into that line. Then after all this is cut out, we'll go back with a flush cut trim bit and trim everything up using that template that we cut out that has the nice smooth edges from the router earlier. So the bearing on the flush cut trim bit will ride against the template, and the actual cutter part will cut out a smooth profile matching that template on the rest of the leg. Now if the template matched up on the leg that I made like it should, I would just be able to put the template in place and cut out everything at once. But because I made the template in a different spot than the actual frame of this by accident, I just had to move the template around several times to where I could get each angle in each corner that I needed and then match up those straight profiles. So it ended up working okay. It took a little bit longer than I would have wanted to, but it did work in the end. And once I got that first leg frame cut out, I was able to use that leg frame as a template on the second, so that did save me some time. You may have noticed earlier that the bottom angle on my template wasn't perfect, but that's really easy to fix using a spindle sander, and a spindle sander will take out any imperfections out of the curve very easily. The next step in this process was to use a 1/2 inch roundover bit to round all of the sides on these bottom bases, but I needed to leave a section in the very middle of each piece that wasn't rounded over where these pieces would interlock, which will make a whole lot more sense here in just a second. So I used a scrap piece to trace the width of the frames of these pieces onto the exact center of one piece, and then using the miter saw I cut that middle section out. Now honestly I hated using the miter saw for this because the miter saw is typically not the most accurate, but this was the least sketchy option that I could come up with, and trying to cut this somehow on the crosscut sled or on the table saw or with any other method. And so if you want an example of how accurate the domino is, then this next section of the video is for you. So I used the domino to join these pieces together, and I did that by cutting a mortise on each end of the piece that I just cut in half, but also a mortise right through the middle of the other piece that wasn't cut in half. Then using the tenons, I could put these pieces together first by putting the tenons on one piece that I cut in half, driving those tenons through the middle piece that wasn't cut in half, and then when those tenons popped through the middle piece, I could put that other piece in place, which lined up absolutely perfect. So you just saw the dry fit, but I repeated the process using glue, and then those clamp blocks on the outside were used once again to hold everything right in place. After the glue was dry, I finished that middle joint seam with the roundover bit, and then it was time to sand everything down. And if you thought that using an orbital sander was lots of fun, you should try sanding all these roundover joints by hand. One last step on the tabletop was to use a roundover bit on the top and then a chamfer bit on the bottom. I sanded everything down once again to 120, and then I'm using Rubio Monocoat Pure as the finish on this table. If you are unfamiliar with Rubio Monocoat, it is an oil-based finish that is incredibly easy to apply. All you have to do is spread it with the plastic card spreader, buff it into the wood, and then wipe off the excess, and you are done. It truly is a one-coat system that will result in a great finish every single time. So this next step is probably unnecessary, but I wanted to put a C-channel in the bottom of this table to make sure that it would stay flat over time. And this is done by routing 2 grooves into the bottom of the table that the C-channel will set down inside of. A lot of times you'll see that the middle portion in between these 2 grooves is also chewed out with the router so that that'll set completely flush down in there, but I really didn't see any reason that that was necessary. So I just installed the C-channel as you can see here. And you do that by first marking the middle of each of those elongated slots, removing the C-channel, drilling out a hole and putting threaded inserts in place. Then after we put the channel back in, we will use furniture bolts to hold it in place right into each one of those threaded inserts. And because of the shape of the C-channel, it'll prevent the table from bowing over time, but it'll also keep everything nice and flat. Also, the grooves are extended just a little beyond the C-channel, so expansion and contraction of the tabletop is not an issue over time. Where the C-channel was unfortunately protruding a little from the bottom of the tabletop, I had to route out a groove where that C-channel would set right down into the tabletop. So I just grabbed a straight bit and I freehanded the best I could and clamped my square on the edge to get a flat end on each side. I next drilled a hole right in the center where that center bolt would go, and then I flipped the whole thing over and recessed some leveling feet right up into the inside of the table in case either this wasn't perfectly level or the floor wherever this would end up would not be level. I previously did a video on these leveling feet in a lot more detail, so if you want more information on what exactly I'm doing here, check out the video at the top of the screen. To attach this base to the tabletop, I will be using Z-clips, which is by far my preferred way to attach tabletops. So I cut out some slots with my router and then I could pop the Z-clips in place. If you do use that bit in the router, just be aware that there is a kickback risk, so make sure that you go extra slow when using that cutter. The only thing left to do was to put the screws into those Z-clips going into the tabletop to secure it in place. And finally, add a little Rubio maintenance oil to the top, which will bump the sheen up and make this look like a finished piece. So here are some final shots and pictures of this table. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. This is by far one of my favorite pieces that I have ever made, and I really enjoyed this build and thought it turned out great. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more, and I will see you next time.